Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Tanya study. We began last week, chapter 22, and we continue today, the second part of 22. We began the topic of how is it possible if God is part of everything and everything is God, because there is no place devoid of godliness, that there can be idol worshippers, that there can be prohibited creatures, behavior, objects, etc. And I shared with you last week the idea that the universe God created and all its inhabitants are divided into two parts, an external and an internal. The external are therefore a means to an end. The internal is the real purpose. So when God says celebrate Shabbat, it's the internal. When God says 6 days shall you work and earn a living, it's internal, because that's how you serve God. God says don't cheat to avoid paying taxes, saving money. When someone don't follow and they end up doing something which is against God's will, they actually connecting with the external aspect of God. The rabbi will continue, or last week shared that when you serve somebody out of love and caring, you show him your face. I think I shared with you that when you study and you want to get the content, you look at the teacher's face. It's much different than not seeing the teacher. What happens if someone is forced to deliver an object? They throw it behind their back. They knock on the door until the person enters the door. And when the person appears in front of the door, they throw it to him behind their back, it's called. In their behind. Behind is called achoraim. Achoraim means in the back. Backwards is achor. Panim, face is pnimiyut, internalize. Internalizing is pnimi, and the inside. Inside in Hebrew is panim, which is the same as face, because that reflects my internal aspects, my love, my fear, etc. When God created these non-kosher animals, they're there to serve a purpose, not for consumption, not for interaction, etc. But they do exist from the, so to say, the behind energy of God as opposed to the internal. That's why there are things that are forbidden for us, because they are from the external aspect of God, and God asked us to connect to the internal. So what happens if I connect to the external aspect of godliness, the energy, the external? I am cutting off my relationship with God. I am showing my back to God. And by doing so, I am disengaging. I detach myself from godliness, which is the opposite of where we should be. This is so far. The rabbi is going to continue on the same theme and share with us another aspect to the word acherim, other. Until now, the first interpretation of other God, thou shalt not worship any other God. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai. You should not have any other God other than me. Al panai, my face, but it's now we understand it should be internal. Other, acher, until now we understood as like if you're forced to give someone something because the king ordered you, or it's the law, you throw it behind the back. That's called acher. That's called behind. Achoraim. Achoraim is the back. And therefore, anytime you interact with objects which are ungodly meaning not they are against God, God created them, but they are a means to an end. Therefore, the purpose of us proving our relation, our dedication to God, then we are worshiping other gods. if we interact with that prohibited object. So that's the first interpretation. The rabbi now is going to go into another aspect of acher, of other, and that is, and that's the topic of our discussion. And I started sharing, and I'll have many stories to that effect, because it is the core of what Hasidic movement is about, which is humility, humbleness. Because if a person is not humble, he is another entity. Other entity kind of pushes God away. If I'm humble before God, I invite God into my dwelling, to my life. What happens if I say, and I take the credit, and no one is as good as I am, and how come you don't honor me? What happens is I attribute success, honor, achievements to myself, and God is removed. If God is removed, I'm created another God, because I am my own God. That's the other interpretation. Thou shalt not worship any other God. The first interpretation is interacting with prohibited behavior is like connecting with God's energy that comes through the back, through the behind. Now, the other interpretation is when I'm not humble and I'm self-centered and allow my ego to exist, I've created another God in the platform of God, in where God is, everywhere. And that is what it refers to, that prohibition. It's not about idol worshiping, although there are idol worshippers in the Far East, millions, billions. But what God, the commandment is to us, for us today, in our universe, in our country, it refers to either do not interact with prohibited activities or objects, or the second one that we'll focus today, do not consider yourself haughty or self-centered, because by doing so, you have created another God. Did I make myself clear? Yes.
The person is so fundamentally and completely materialistic that they always have to have the best and most expensive this, and most expensive that. Is that idolatry?
I don't understand the question.
I withdraw the question.
Okay. This is the Kabbalah interpretation of idol worshiping. The first interpretation is anytime we interact or engage in activity that is prohibited. The second one, and that's the focus of our discussion, is anytime we allow our ego to run the show. Allowing the ego, giving the ego space, enable that ego to create a separate entity other than God. And therefore, that is a transgression of thou shalt not worship any other gods. By the way, the only place that God says, I cannot dwell, there is a famous story of Rabbi Israel of Ruzhin. One of the most famous rabbis. Is actually the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And I need to answer because, was that you, Elizabeth?
I thought I had it on mute. Sorry, Rabbi.
The Rabbi Israel of Ruzhin once visited a town, and two men invited him over to spend the night. One who was a great God-fearing, super kosher, super duper kosher in his house. All the food was with 7 different supervisions, and he had a rabbi checking every menu, every item. However, he felt that he deserved honor, and he always would demand respect. The other person wasn't such God-fearing. He sometimes was late to celebrate Shabbat. And he sometimes, if there was a discount, a special price for food that was not necessarily Hasidic slaughtering, he would buy the meat. What we call in modern day language, he would cut corners from time to time. And Rabbi Israel of Ruzhin, however, is a very humble man. He didn't feel that he was any special. However, the rabbi is visiting. He felt it was a great honor. So the rabbi turned to him and says, I will stay in your house. Those days, there was no hotels. You stayed with family, friends, or somebody that opened their home. So he stayed there. So the other man turned to him and says, I don't understand. His house, the mezuzah on his door is not that expensive. Who knows, maybe it's not kosher. The food his wife is going to feed you is not the best Hasidic shchita, it's not. So the rabbi turned to him and he says, in the Torah, by the way, I think it's in next week's portion, in this week's portion, at the end of the portion, God says that whenever the Jewish people misbehave, the Torah, God says, I am your God, Ashochen itam betoch tumotam, who dwells among them while they are defiled. Even when they are defiled, God says, I'm resting among them. So God says, even if you have a Jew who is a sinner, God dwells among them. However, there is one exception that God said he will not dwell among those people, and these are haughty people. It says in the Torah, Ein ani vahu yecholim ladur, me and him cannot reside or dwell under the same roof. So he says to him, you always ask for honor and respect. You always feel that you're special. Perhaps God is not there. That man may not have the kosher food in the house, and the mezuzah may be just after the fact kosher, but not super kosher. But it says in the Torah that God will dwell among the Jewish people even while they sin and misbehave. In other words, haughtiness, self-centeredness is so despicable, and I'm going to show more stories, that it is something that we need to put in a separate category from all other sin. And that's why thou shalt not worship any other gods equals to be allowing my ego to run the show. So, by the way, the third Rebbe of Chabad, the Tzemach Tzedek, the grandson of this Rebbe, said that any time you say thank God or with God's help, you allow for God to rest among us because you attribute credit to God. Anytime you say, how beautiful my creation, how beautiful, this design, this furniture, and you try to get credit to yourself, what you do is push God away. Simple as that. Let's start reading, and we're going to get a little further, and I'll show you some stories. So we've concluded on page 300 on top. This is called the hinder part of the supernal whale. Thus we see that the klipot, the shells, the other side are designated Elokim Acherim, other gods, because they derive from Achoraim, from the hinder part of the divine will. That's the first interpretation to other. Now, the supernal will of the quality of continence, that is the inner aspect of God's will, which is directed toward the ultimate object of God's desire, is the source of life which animates all worlds. We spoke about means to an end versus the end itself. Internal versus external, that's what the rabbi is going to say. But since it is not bestowed on the Sitra Achra at all, on the other side at all, and even the hinder part of the divine will is not actually clothed within it, but merely encompasses it from above. Therefore, it is the above of death. That's the abode of death, and impurity may God preserve us from them. For the minute measure of light and life that it derives, and that it absorbs internally from the external aspect of divine holiness, is in a state of actual exile within it, as in the concept of the exile of the Shekhinah within the Klippa described earlier. The point the rabbi is saying that the other sides, those who oppose God, the creatures that are unholy, they receive God's energy. However, it's so minute that they can exist to defy godliness. And the best way to drive this point is and I shared it on several occasions, where you have a thief who goes to steal, knowing that it is an act against God, and yet he turned to God and in prayer, asking God to make sure no one is catching him and he'll be able to succeed in his mission. It's a dichotomy, it's self-contradictory, but it's done because the idea of God in his life is so external that both opposites, one way, he believes in God and he knows God is the only one who can help him. On the other hand, he's asking God to help him to achieve something that God makes sure to know, to make sure that he knows that's unacceptable. But yet he's able to do both at the same time, because God in his life is so external that those opposites can exist. What if God is internalized as part of his life? You wouldn't have that challenge. You wouldn't dare try to ask God to help him achieve that sin. And that's why it is for this reason too that the Klippa is termed other gods, apart from the reason given above, namely that the Klippa derived from Achoraim, from the inner part of God's will. From the inner part means a much smaller quality of energy, and therefore it allows for a dichotomy, for a contradiction. For it constitutes actual idolatry and denial of the unity of God, the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. The explanation of these two reasons is as follows. Every created being is animated by two types of divine life force. One is an internalized life force, which is beamed to suit the character and capacity of each individual creature. It is this power that determines the character of each being. It becomes one with it, and it felt by it. In fact, this internalized life force constitutes its identity. The second type of life force is an encompassing, transcendental nature. It does not adapt itself to the individual character of each being and is not clothed within it. Rather, it animates from without, so to speak, from its own level, above the created being which it animates. The rabbi is saying that this is the rabbi that teaches Tanya, Rabbi Yosef Weinberg. He says that there are two aspects of energy. There is one part of energy that internalizes, becomes part of who I am. Energy that enters and becomes part in different compartments of my body, and therefore it adapts my character. There is another aspect of energy which encompasses, it's all outside. That part is not who I am. That part can be moved from me to somebody else and can adapt different personalities because it did not, so to say, molded itself to my character and my personalities. God wants us to internalize godliness, make godliness internalized, meaning that my character is shaped by godliness. Therefore, I'm not going to lie, and I'm not going to raise my voice, and I'm not going to eat not kosher, and I'm not going to skip a holiday, because godliness demands to connect with what God says. Then we have another personality whose godliness is only outside. He's Jewish. He's proud to be Jewish. He knows God is watching the Jewish people, but that's where it ends. Ask him about Shabbat, ask him about prayer, ask him about keeping kosher. He's not sure about that. And the reason is because that part is all encompassing. It's outside. That's what we call external. That's what we call hinder part. That's what we call a means to an end. It's not the purpose of their life, and therefore there can be a contradiction. That person can pray to God to succeed in committing a sin. The klippa is the shell or the other side too, animated by these two types of divine life force. The latter type, the external, since it does not permeate them, does not conflict with their ego. The klippot, the shells or the other side, can thus consider themselves independent beings, even while acknowledging God as the source of their vitality. They need not deny Him. With regards to this type of godly life force, the klipot are called Elokim Acherim, other gods, only because they received their life from the Achoraim, from the hinder part of God's will. So why do you call it other gods? Because they get their sustenance from the other part of God, the other energy, which is external, which is the hinder part. The klipot, these shells, cannot, however, acknowledge the former internalized type of God life force, while asserting at the same time that they are separate from God. To do so would be self-contradictory, for, as explained, this kind of life force constitutes the very identity of every created being. The klipot therefore completely deny this life force, and it is thus truly in a state of exile within them. It is thus, with regard to this life force, that the klipot are called Elokim Acherim, other gods, in the literal sense of the term, implying idolatry and a denial of God's unity. They are totally ignorant, or they are totally in denial of the internal aspect of God that shapes the character and internalize them. Therefore, they can dispute God and go against him. For
And at the same time, have great pride in being Jewish.
yes, it's a self-contradictory. By the way, this is life, the way we live a life. How many people will portray themselves in one way and live a whole different lifestyle? And when they are being taken to the, being questioned, they would find every excuse in the book to justify. And that's part of what he's talking about. This, the Alter Rebbe now goes on to say, page 302, for inasmuch as the light and life force inasmuch as the light and the life of holiness, that is the internalized life force, are in a state of exile within the klipa, it does not surrender itself at all to the holiness of God. On the contrary, it soars aloft like an eagle, saying, I am, and there is nothing beside me. Or as in the statement of Pharaoh, the river is mine, and I have made myself. There was a rabbi that used to teach Tanya in yeshiva in Russia. And he would tell the students, you know how bad haughtiness is? Self-centeredness will destroy you. Where do we see that? From Pharaoh. You know what? God comes to him on many occasions and say, I am God, please obey my command. You know what he says? I will not listen to God. Who is God I should listen to? In other words, he's putting himself, his needs, his desires, his thoughts process, and God. And therefore, he sees himself, not God. It destroyed Egypt, it destroyed him, and it caused him to be totally gone. All because of his self-centeredness, not because of the enslavement of the Jewish people. All that he did, there was nowhere that we find that he was punished until he refused to listen to God. In other words, we need to understand that the catalyst for every curse and every separation from God is not necessarily sin, but our ego. The ego is what makes us separated from God, not sin. As I said, in this week's Torah portion, towards the end, we read that God will rest among the Jewish people even while they are fully defiled themselves. That is why, by the way, so therefore the Egyptian, anybody heard that Pharaoh considered himself a god? You study that, anybody? Ivan, did you hear that? That's why he would go to the bathroom in the morning to the river, because he's a god. He didn't need to go to the bathroom. That's other god. Humility, humbleness would have achieved would have enabled him to be so successful and happy. But because he's a god, that's what caused God's wrath to come upon them. That's the only reason, nothing else. That's why the sages of blessed memory said that arrogance is truly tantamount to idolatry. In the Talmud teaches us that arrogance is like worship other gods. Now we understand why, because it's actually idol, creating another god outside of God. For the essence and root of idolatry is that it is regarded as an independent entity, separate from the holiness of God. Idolatry does not imply an outright denial of God, as it is stated in the Gemara that they of the realm of Klippa call him the God of gods, so that although they do not deny his supremacy, their statement nevertheless constitutes idolatry. The Talmud tells us that idol worshippers, especially in ancient times, did not deny that God does not exist. They came to they were way brighter than we are, and they were able to philosophize that there must be a creator of the universe, there must be a God. However, they worship other entities as the God, other gods, and they called our Lord as God of their gods, the super gods, but they're connecting to their gods. Anybody heard of Christianity? That's the same thing. There is a supreme God, but there is a Trinity, right? I'm not going to go any farther than that. What if somebody says to you, believe in that guy, he's going to be Messiah one day? You know what I say to him? I connect directly to my God. I don't need intermediary. And that's the end of the discussion. In other words, in the Talmud and earlier in Abraham's time, they knew there is a God, but they worship the sun or a rock or a tree, and they knew that he is our God, is the God of all other gods. As Jewish people, that is the second commandment: thou shalt not worship any other God. Separating ourselves from God, putting an intermediary in the middle, is idol worship. So it can be on a microcosm where I set myself apart from God because I put my ego and arrogance, or compared to nations, in the macro, it can be if I put another intermediary between me and God, and that constitute idol worshiping. Rather, because they consider themselves to be separate entities and independent beings, and thereby they separate themselves from the holiness of God, since they do not efface themselves before him. For the supernal holiness rests only on that which is surrendered to him, as explained above. For this reason, the Zohar calls the Klipot peaks of separations, mountain peaks of separation. That is, they are as haughty as mountain peaks and are thus separate from God. But this constitutes a denial of God's true unity, since his unity implies that all is esteemed as nothing before him, and that all is utterly nullified before him and before his will, which animates them all, and which continuously brings them into being out of nothingness. Arrogance, therefore, which is the aggrandizement of one's own identity, is diametrically opposed to the surrender of one's identity, which is a corollary of concept of God's unity. Arrogance does represent a denial of the unity of God, and for this reason the Gemara equates it with idolatry. So I'm going to share with you some stories about idolatry, because it is the essence of what the Hasidic movement is all about. To read and eradicate what do you call arrogance, or what do you call arrogance in Hebrew? Anybody knows? Yesh. It's two separate things.
Isn't it man?
No, No, ish.
Good try.
What's the word in Hebrew for nothingness or humility? Ayin, not ain. Ain is, there is none, but it's in a different context. Ayin, Aleph Yud Nun. Ayin means nothing. Ayin with an ayin is I, which I'll show it you at the connection soon. How do you say I in Hebrew? Ayin. Ayin Yud Nun. How do you say nothing in Hebrew? Aleph Yud Nun. Okay, it's two separate things. Aleph Yud Nun is nothing. The rabbi says that good eye is a great blessing. There is no greater, the good heart is greater than good eye, but good eye will cause others to benefit from that person if he has a good eye. Why? Because they put the other person before their own ego. If I see someone, there is a lot to be said. I'm sharing with you just summary of these topics. I'm jumping from topic to topic because I want to get to the main point of humility or humbleness. When people hear of a travesty or a very sad event, everybody joined and everybody feels sorry and everybody is there to help. What happened when people are successful? He landed a good job. He was appointed the man of the year. Jealousy grows. We call it the evil eye because evil eye can hurt. We're not discussing evil eye. I'll not entertain any question. But the evil eye can cause a lot of pain. Evil eye is created because of ego. Because as you say, jealousy. How come I don't have that? How come he has as much as I do? How come he's so successful? What is good eye? Good eye is I'm so happy for that person because you know that God will not take something from me to give him. God has plenty for both of us. And if that person is very successful, I'm very happy for that person because I should congratulate him. I should be happy for that person. That's called good eye. Where does good eye come from? Humility. If there is no humility, there is no place for good eye. So for Hasidim, when they share together a Farbrengen, which is one of the legs by which the Hasidic movement stands, there are three legs: a melody, nigun, a Farbrengen, and the connection to the Rebbe. The Farbrengen, to get together where everybody is there for each other, not in their trouble, but in their success. When you see each other and you see their success and you hear about their achievements and you're happy for them, it makes the person humble. There was a famous rabbi, his name is Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz. He was the rabbi of a town called Shkalov. Anybody heard of Shkalov? Shkolov? Very famous town in Poland. In the time of the Alter Rebbe, this time. He had a son, Reb Pinchas. Pinchas later became a rabbi. And a rabbi of a town, very famous Chassid. One time, this Reb Pinchas became a Chassid. He came to visit his father. And his father turned to him, a Chassid of the Alter Rebbe, of this. And his father turned to him and says, why are you connected to the Hasidim? If you are looking to serve God appropriately, there is a book called Reshit Chochmah. Have anybody heard of the book Reshit Chochmah? It's a famous book that has different chapters. Some of them had to rebuking, some of them had to work on your characteristic and develop the positive one, getting rid of the negative ones. Reshit Chochmah. He says there is a book that was established many years back. You don't need Hasidic movement to refine your personality, character. And Reb Pinchas, the son, turned to Reb Hanoch and he said to him, I will give you a test to explain to you. I will share, I'm willing to show you what I gained by being a Chassid. And he turned to his father and he said to him, will you be willing for the next 2 weeks to study Reishis Chochmah, that book that refines your character and put emphasis on the positive characters and helps you get rid of the negative characters? And the father says, I'm willing to do it. So for 2 weeks, he devoted his life to studying that book. Towards the end of the 2 weeks, this rabbi had a helper. He had a man, a sexton, someone who always assisted him. The son turned to the helper and he says, I would like you to do me a favor, but you need to help me. And the man said, sure. Says, next time my father asks for help, he's going to ask you for help. You turn to him and you say to him, why do I always have to serve you? How about you serve me back? Why don't you do the same thing for me? And see what my father has to say. Sure enough, they both on a Friday afternoon went to mikveh. This man carried this bag with a change of clothes for Shabbos and the soap. And I don't know if you've been to a mikveh in ancient time. Probably it was you hit somebody in the back.
Willows or
You know,
Flagellation.
you know what? I'll change it. The rabbi needed to get dressed. He turned to the helper and says, help me put on my shoes and tie the shoes. That was his job. He got paid. And the man turned to the rabbi and says, always I do it to you. Why don't you do it for me one time? Now, under different circumstances, the rabbi would say, how dare you? You're fired. But he learned Reishis Chochmah. He refined himself to humble himself. So he turned and he actually did it. The son heard about the exchange. So he turned to his father on a Friday night. He says, Dad, I heard that your helper today reversed the roles and made you his helper. How did it feel? And the father says, he quoted in the Jewish world, sometimes you answer with a quote from the Torah, which contains a lot more than just a few words. So he returned to his son and he says there is a phrase in the story of Bilam. Anybody heard of Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet? He walked through the very narrow strait and the donkey pushed the leg of Bilam against the wall, and he hit the donkey 3 different times. And then God opens up the donkey's mouth, and the donkey turned to him and says, why have you done that to me? And Bilam turned to the donkey and says, Lu yesh cherev beyadi. If I only had a sword in my hand. That's the text in the Torah. So the rabbi turns to his son and he said, when he asked me, Lu yesh cherev beyadi, meaning I was ready to kill him. So the son turned to the father and says, you see, that's the difference between a chassid and someone who studies Reishit Chochmah. We both learn to humble ourselves. However, you feel so pained about this kind of behavior. By Hasidim, it doesn't even start. You can be someone's helper, and if they ask you for help, you do it. You enjoy the act of connection with people. There is a lady that shared the following story. Her father was a mashpia, a teacher of Tanya and Hasidic teaching to yeshiva boys. And many times they would come to his house for a farbrengen. And Thursday night, we used to go around finding someone to be willing to spend the night with us, to study and to teach. And he continuously spoke about you have to get rid of your yesh. You have to get rid of your arrogance. So the daughter, she was a little girl. She used to hear it from her father all the time. One day she turned to her father. She was a young girl. She relayed that story in later years when she was much older. She turned to her father and says, you talk about get rid of the yesh, get rid of the yesh. How do you get rid of it? So he said to her, what do you mean, how do you get rid of it? You break it. So she says to him, if I break it, I don't get rid of it. I used to have one big yesh, now I have two small yesh. So he said to her, it's better to have two small yesh than one big yesh. Everybody can draw the lesson from it, but to me, it's a very profound point, and that is, you cannot necessarily get rid of the yesh completely, but it's better to have two small yesh than to have one big yesh.
Your chin?
Your chin, yes.
There is.
There is, that's what we're talking about.
It's also means ego, or arrogance.
Yes. In relations to a human character, yes, is the most despicable character. Now, when God created the universe, we call it yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. So something is created, the universe. But that universe is conceals godliness. One more story. The Baal Shem Tov once traveled with his students and arrived in a small town. They arrived in town where there was a known man to be a porush. Porush means a person who was separated from the universe, and he studied Torah all day long. He studied Torah so much that he used to answer questions with the phrase prefacing, so said Elijah the prophet. In other words, when students of Talmud or Torah would not be able to interpret the Talmud, or they had questions, they would come to him and ask them, and he would answer them and say, Elijah the prophet told me. In other words, he had conversed with Elijah the prophet. In the same town, there was a very poor beggar that can hardly read Hebrew properly. He would misspell the words of Siddur. But he was a God-fearing, humble human being. The Baal Shem Tov wanted to teach his students something. So he said, let's go to the humble man's house, knock on the door, and tell him we want to use his dining room for studying. They walk into his house, and they invite him to sit down and listen to the study, even though he had no idea what they were talking about. He didn't even understand, he can hardly read. Then the Baal Shem Tov says, put your hands on each other's shoulder. The Baal Shem Tov did it many times. And close your eyes. And make sure this man, the hosts, you put the closest student on his shoulder, and the other closest shoulder on the other shoulder, and then everybody making a circle and close your eyes. Once they close their eyes, the Baal Shem Tov would show them. It's many times you do it in synagogue. And when they close their eyes, they felt that they are in heaven, in a very, very beautiful marketplace where they can go shopping for the most pleasurable, beautiful objects they can have dreamt. And then the Baal Shem Tov removed his hands from the students near him, and then he told them, you can open up your eyes. The experience was awesome, out of this world. And then he says, let's go to this Porush. He lives in the other side of town, who don't go to work. People are supplying him with food, and all he does is study. And he always would tell people, so said Elijah. And the Baal Shem Tov, again, turned to the man and says, we came to study Torah. I would like to know if we can study around you. I think he was in the synagogue, living in synagogue. He would go home only for Friday night and Saturday night. And he agreed. And the Baal Shem Tov, again, asked the closest student to put his hand on the shoulder of that Porush and the other ones, and then to put the students on the Baal Shem Tov. And then as soon as he put his hands on the shoulders of the two students near him, he said, close your eyes. Close their eyes. They saw snakes and scorpions, venomous snakes of all kinds. They've never seen such big snakes. And they opened up their eyes. They were shocked. They were scared. And the Baal Shem Tov turned to him and says, why are you so scared? And they said, what we saw is dangerous. People who cannot experience that. And he says to them, you see, you can have someone who has Elijah the prophet come and speak to him, but he is the most despicable human being that only snakes and scorpions rest. No angels, no positive. And the reason is because they consider themselves of great value, worth very much. But there are other men who can hardly utter words properly. He's so humble because he knows where he belongs. He knows his space. He knows that he's not special. He knows that he's not studying Torah. Because of the humility that he expresses, God is resting among him. His house is literally heaven. If you can experience that as you did for a little moment, you can experience the heavens in his house. But this man who studied Torah for many years, and he's able to say, so said Elijah, and he's not lying. He did not lie about that, yet this is not the Jewish way. So therefore, it's not about what you know. It's not about who you know. It's not about what you talents. It's about how do you allow God to enter. If I am humbling, if I humble myself, God is part of my life. It doesn't matter if I know a lot of Torah. It doesn't matter if I'm busy doing mitzvot all day, but God will rest. What happens to somebody on the other extreme who are boasting about their achievements and are very special and make sure everybody calls them by their titles, etc.? Then on the book, they show that they achieve greatly, but there is no connection with God. There is no relationship. It's the other God. It's thou shalt not worship any other God. So let's summarize this chapter, because next chapter, if we study, I'm not sure, but next week we're going to go into a whole different topic. What the rabbi has told us in this chapter is that the reason there is opposite of godliness, activities, objects that are seen, is God wanted to have internal and external expression of God. And therefore, he wants us to connect with the internal aspect of godliness and not the external. The rabbi goes on to explain that every time we connect to the external of God, we are separating ourselves from God because it's against God's will. In another language, the rabbi explained that is that when someone is forced to give something, he throws it, but he don't want to have a relationship. That's what external. So when the Torah tells us, thou shalt not worship other gods, it refers to any time we connect with God in the external aspect and not the internal aspect. Internal aspect is also internalizing ourselves within ourselves and become part of who we are. External is hovering over, and it has no effect on our behavior and our conduct. The last part that Rabbi was talking about is haughtiness. Self-centeredness is what drives gods away, and that's how we create other gods. That's why Pharaoh considered himself a god, and therefore he refused to listen to God, and that's what caused him is derail and total destruction of the country. When we want to connect to God, when we want to stay away from other gods, the first thing we need is to experience humbleness, to experience humility. By doing so, we are inviting God into our homes. We may not be able to pray properly, we may not keep the mitzvot properly, which we should, but we may not. It does not take God away from our life. What if we do everything that God is asking, but we always ask for credit, we always feel that it's our achievements? There's no God. Actually, we have created other gods. So when we talk about thou shalt not worship other gods, we're not talking about idol worshiping, we're talking about arrogance, and that creates other gods. This concludes chapter 22. So chapter 23 is going to a whole different... Until now, we spoke about the universe. Remember, we talked about speech, the two aspects of speech, how it's with God, he can take back the speech, and how the speech expresses my intention. Chapter 22 is about how come in the universe there are other gods, there is separation of God. Now the rabbi is going to talk about the comparison of the body to God, the human body that contains 248 body limbs, how the Torah affects and expresses the relationship between us and God, and that will bring back to the universe how the universe is important for God. So we'll meet again next week, God willing. Thank you very much, everybody.